energy matters in South Africa and on the continent. That is Lungile in a nutshell. I'm sure she'll tell you more when she starts her presentation. But thank you so much again, Lungile, for accepting the invite for the seminar. I'm sure we'll spend about 30 minutes to 45 minutes. We'll give you 30 to 45 minutes to give us your presentation. But just before you begin, these are the common house rules. Please do ensure that your mics are on mute and that your videos are off. All right. And with that said, I will then hand over the mic to Lungile, okay, who will then begin her presentation for the afternoon. Thank you so much, Lungile. Over to you.
Thank you so much for having me. Now, I'm a very animated person, and I've decided I'm going to switch my camera on. I'm not sure if you can see me.
Yes, we can.
Awesome stuff. So I can smile a bit more as well. I was not going to let this makeup go to waste. But let me go straight into it. Today was going to be speaking about a topic that is rather passionate for me. I have spent very long periods of time working on the African continent, working on energy projects in particular, and getting to witness firsthand what a just transition can look like, and successes as well as failures that I've seen on the continent. And through this presentation, I'll be taking you through some of my experiences, but overlaying them also with global experiences as well, and on what we can do better. So right into it. I decided the best way to start, why is it stuck now? Let me use this. Okay, the best way to start is by giving a definition of what a just energy transition is. And I was shocked actually when I started doing this exercise, because it seems not all of us have a common understanding of what we're trying to achieve. And perhaps this is why we are destabilizing the communities that we're purporting to support as well. So Project 90 by 2030 speaks about a just energy transition is a transition towards a sustainable, low carbon and equitable energy system in which is better for people and the planet. And IRENA, which is the International Renewable Energy Agency, says the energy transition is a pathway toward transformation of the global energy sector from fossil-based to zero carbon by the second half of the century. Now, I'm reading the first two and I'm already like, okay, this is about technology swapping. This is about fossil fuels. It's about, zero carbon. And that's what we're basically looking at. I then said, okay, let me look at Greenpeace, because I know that for the most part, they're controversial. And Greenpeace simply says a just transition means moving to a more sustainable economy in a way that's fair to everyone, including people working in polluting industries. Okay, so we're slowly starting to get into the fairness aspect of it and starting to speak about people as well. ESCOM says transition describes the gradual movement towards lower carbon technologies, while just qualifies that this transition will not negatively impact society, jobs, and livelihoods. Now, I thought this was one of the better descriptions, especially given South Africa's context and Africa's context as a whole. And I'm like, okay, we're talking about people, we're talking about economy, and we're talking about livelihoods and making sure that this is secure. And I suppose the best one that I found was actually by the International Trade Union Confederation. And they say a just transition secures the future and livelihoods of workers and their communities in the transition to a low carbon economy. It is based on social dialogue between workers and their unions, employers, government, and communities. A plan for just transition provides and guarantees better and decent jobs, social protection, more training opportunities, and greater job security for all workers affected by global warming and climate change policies. Now, undoubtedly, and I deliberately did this, where I got a quote from a utility, from a trade union, from those NGOs, and it's amazing how everybody is pushing for their own agenda or for what they think should be the focus. Your renewable energy agency will obviously look at technology swaps, and your unions will very much have a strong impact on communities and on people and on reskilling and on retraining. But now, if we go into it, we're told all of this about transitioning, and we're told this is what we would like to achieve. But now I'm going to take us through a couple of facts. So the first thing is that Africa has the lowest contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, if you look at Africa as a continent, we only contribute about 3.8% to global greenhouse gas emissions. China, 23%, the US 19%, European Union at about 13%. That being said, Africa is the most vulnerable to climate change impacts, and we've been witnessing this over the last 5 or more years, whether it's floods, whether it's landslides, we've got water problems, droughts, we've got whether it's your weather patterns that shift, whether it's your El Nino or your El Nino effects as well. And what we also know is that there's disproportionate pressure on South countries to transition faster. So North countries are basically saying, listen, South, you need to transition as fast as you possibly can. And we're even willing to give you funds, but I'll come to that a bit later. But they're basically saying that you need to do all that you can do, even though the global South does not contribute as much to greenhouse gas emissions, in particular Africa. Now, people are always talking about, Africa needs to transition, Africa needs to transition. The truth of the matter is, Africa transitioned a long time ago. If I look at the hydropower that is on the continent, it accounts for, let me say, about 80% of generation. Now, there's a 17% there, and it talks about electricity generation as a whole. And this is obviously taking into account Eskom. And if you look at what Eskom contributes to the total African generating capacity, it dwarfs every other country. So this is why hydro will look small in that context. But if you look at countries such as the DRC, Ethiopia, Malawi, Mozambique, Zambia, up to 80% of their electricity mix is made up of hydro. And guess what? Hydro is not considered green. There have been ongoing debates between the renewable energy agencies, between various government entities, and they say that no, but it's not green because of the materials that are basically used, and that it's not as renewable as we'd like it to be. It's a long story. I will not get into it, but what I will tell you is that the very same EU that is against Africa saying hydro is green is at the moment busy classifying nuclear as well as gas green. Why? Because obviously this is beneficial to them, first and foremost. I say this often, and I think it's very important, even as we get into this conversation, that by thinking small on energy, we confine millions of people to poverty. If we look at the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions globally now, they come from basically burning fossil fuels for electricity, heat, and transportation. Now, electricity makes sense in the African context. Yes, we do burn oil, we burn gas, and we burn, coal. Heat, not so much so. We're not very big on heat as the African continent. I think we are very blessed in that aspect, that we've got sufficient sun to heat up like our homes, and our temperatures are not as dire as what you'd experience in other parts of the world. Then there's transportation as well. Now, why is this such a big thing, this fossil fuels? We're seeing it play itself out with the Russian oil and gas sanctions. So it was very easy for the world to, or no, well, not the world, Europe and the US to say, no, we're going to place a sanction on your Russian oil and everybody must sort themselves out. USA obviously has their WTI. Other countries can go and source Brent in other parts of Europe. So it was not such a big deal. But the real problem came with gas, because Russia has gas. And right now, well, it's been winter like in Europe, and one of the key things is that they need gas for this heating in their homes. So this week alone, I think it was Germany as well as Hungary that said that they are not going to ban Russian gas. Despite what everybody else is saying, what everybody is doing, but their communities and their population need Russian gas. In Africa, if we look at the largest share of greenhouse gas emissions, these come from agriculture, forestry, land use. These are the biggest drivers of emissions in Africa. Yet the focus is on energy. Now, one might say, but this is a bit counterintuitive, because if you're getting them in agriculture, forestry, and land use, surely those should be your focus areas. Surely when we speak of just transition, let's look at our agriculture, agro-processing, facilities. What are we doing? Forestry, deforestation. What are we doing in those spaces? And focus on those spaces. I'm not saying leave the energy out, but if that's where the biggest focus is, where's all the heat? Where's all the energy? But where's all the drive for agriculture, forestry, and those sectors? What we do know about sub-Saharan Africa, however, is that 60% of the people living here do not have access to electricity. Instead, we are told that Africa should not go the industrial route. Africa should not follow what Europe has done. They do not need to be connected to the grid. Africa must simply leapfrog. Okay. Now, I've seen some very interesting examples of leapfrogging on the continent. You've got people that will come and say, no, you shouldn't burn biomass, don't burn wood, which I completely agree with, because you're cutting down trees, right? And then they're saying, but we're not going to electrify you either. Because that is a waste of resources and we are trying to decarbonize. So it doesn't make sense to send transmission lines all the way to that rural part of the country. But we're going to give you solar bag and you must put all your food in there and leave it in the sun. Maybe it's just me, but we live in Africa. I particularly live in South Africa. Theft is a thing. It's a real thing. I can imagine you leaving your oxtail or whatever meat you've decided to cook in a heating bag outside for everybody to see, including the village dogs as well. It's stuff like that where I sit there and I'm like, are we honestly serious about transitioning Africa, or are we just trying to appease them and make things not as bad as what they seem? Then, of course, we entered into the phase of residential solar systems. Now, not what you're thinking with the big PV and the batteries and the Tesla power, is it a power ball or power box? No, not that. I'm talking a small little panel, maybe about this size, with 4 little lights in the house. And then it's got a small little battery and a radio, and people use it to charge their phones and to listen to the radio. Now, this is all fine and well. But what happens when people need to study at night, late into the night? Those solar systems don't last for 20 hours or for even 5 hours, 2-3 hours maximum, and they're out. So what actually happens? We are not solutioning people in ways that will help them advance and industrialize and get to where we want them to get to. We're simply saying, oh, no, it's fine, but the lights are on and that will do, and that's enough. The other one, and I think the one that upsets me the most, are what we call the solar water pumping, right? So typically in a village setting, you've got a water pump and little boys, little girls will go there and they'll pump this water. It's a time-consuming exercise, and then the buckets are also heavy that they have to carry. So in came a group of people and said, no, we've got solar water pumping. Great stuff. What does it do? Large solar panel, you attach it next to the pump, it pumps water. Oh, awesome. So little girls don't have to, pump, and little boys don't have to. Yes, absolutely. Automated pumping. Awesome stuff. Ah, okay. So now, do they still have to walk to these pumps? Oh, yes, they still have to walk there. So they can't go to school. Ah, okay. So they need to walk there in the morning, they need to walk there in the afternoons as well. So they still need to carry these heavy buckets. Oh, no, but then we can introduce like a wheelbarrow. And I'm like, okay, I thought the focus of this was basically to leapfrog so that little boys, little girls can start going to school and forget about picking up, firewood in the morning or, fetching water. And I've seen so many of these installations around the continent, and they're always on the guise of, oh, but we're helping and we're doing amazing things. But, and honestly, I'm just like, but would reticulated water not have been a better option? Would transmission lines and distribution lines not have been better options? And so I'm very wary of this word leapfrogging, because we're leapfrogging into obscurity, basically, whilst the rest of the continent, or rather the rest of the world, industrializes and moves on with grid-tied electricity, or even microgrids for that matter. The rest of the world is looking at biofuels for aviation. You're looking at hydrogen, LPG, CNG. CNG is your compressed natural gas for mining and commuter vehicles. If you are in the Tshwane area, for instance, the community buses that are run, they're called, I think, is it Rea? No, it's not Rea Vaya, it's Arieng, and they run on CNG. And that's where we are as a society, yet we are quite happy to confine millions of other people to energy poverty because we don't see them, we don't notice them. And the reason why I raise this is because we run the risk of doing that in 2022 through a just energy transition by confining millions of people in various other areas to poverty as well. By the way, people often ask, why do we not have beneficiation in South Africa, for instance? We've got lots of mining activity. Why do we not have beneficiation? And the answer is just one: we have no electricity to invest in beneficiation activities, or in factories, or anything of the sort. And you would have thought that government would have said, wait a minute, if there is mining and there is a need to beneficiate, surely electricity, we can do this. Even mining houses would have said, let's do something. But can you see what happens when we think small, where we just want to take minerals out of the ground and leave and forget about that there are entire communities that need to benefit from what is happening? So what matters for Africa? And I've compiled a list of things that I think people need to understand. What matters for people and for governments on the African continent. First and foremost, climate change is an issue for Africa. As I said, it disproportionately affects Africa and southern countries more than northern countries, and this is a fact. That being said, we do contribute only 3.8% to global greenhouse gas emissions. Economic growth is very important to Africa. The GDP of Africa as a whole is sitting at 2.6 trillion. For some of you, this might seem like a large number, but actually it's the size of India's economy. As I was gathering these stats, I sat there and I'm like, tell me again why we were part of BRICS when we are but a small drop in the entire ocean. But anyway, looking at GDP in Africa as a whole, South Africa, those of you who very well know, we used to be number one. We're now at number 3. Nigeria has the highest GDP in Africa, followed by Egypt and South Africa. And it doesn't look like we're going to stay there for much longer. Other countries are developing, they are growing, and they are looking at dethroning us because they're focusing on growing their economies. We look at human and social development, which is HDI, which is the Human Development Index. And it basically looks at a long, healthy life, knowledge, and a decent standard of living. And the first country is Mauritius, followed by the Seychelles, Algeria, Tunisia, Botswana, Libya, and South Africa. I think it should shock us as South Africans that we're behind Libya on a Human Development Index basis. And it's a very telling story because South Africa seems to have slipped from most indices. And I'll touch on that even following next. The other important aspect for Africans is economic transformation. We know that half of Africa live below the poverty line. We also know that per capita GDP is less than it was in 1974. There's been an 11% decline. This basically means that the people who were, it basically means that the people who were alive, breathing, doing well, employed in 1974 are basically doing well, doing better than the people who are alive now. And this should scare us as Africans, because we now have a younger population, the youngest in the world, and yet we are confining them to all kinds of poverty. During the same time period, between 1960 to 2022, the rest of the world grew at 2% growth annually, while we declined 11% as a continent. We also know that Africa has 17% of the world's population, but only 3% of global GDP, which is rather unfortunate. If you look at unemployment stats in South Africa alone, we are the highest unemployment, or the highest youth unemployment as well. And yet we are harping on about just transitions, but we're not speaking about how people are going to benefit. We're not speaking about how the youth are going to benefit. We're not speaking about how we're going to benefit as a region. Instead, we are looking at this as individual countries, and this is when it will come to hurt us the most. And I'll touch on regional blocks a bit later. What also matters for Africa, looking at gender equality, women are responsible for 60% of the work, yet they only earn 10% of the income and only own 1% of property. The parity, as you can see, is far off. 70% of women are excluded financially, and this is referring to globally. If you're looking at a funding gap between men and women on the African continent, it's about 42 billion financing gap between men and women. If we're looking at inclusive growth, looking at inequality or addressing inequality, I looked at the Gini coefficient, and as we all know, South Africa is the highest, which means that we're the highest level of inequality in the world. We are more unequal than Central African Republic, more unequal than Eswatini, Brazil, and Belize. Now, we're looking at all of this, and I want you to remember all these facts, all these stats in the background of us transitioning, that if we are to transition, if you are a country, for instance, like South Africa, which is the most unequal country in the world, and a country with one of the highest unemployment rates in the world, and one of the lowest human development indexes or scores rather, on the African continent, what does transitioning look like for you? What does transitioning look like for Zambia? What does transitioning look like for Mozambique, who are endowed with vast gas resources, or for Namibia, who've just discovered their own oil as well as gas reserves? Also, and just finally, one of the other things that are important for Africa is Africa integration. And why is this important? If you look at how our systems were built, whether it's transmission systems, their transport systems, everything was going out, basically. If you look at how our harbors were placed, our borders, our national routes, everything points towards the harbor, everything points towards minerals exiting, towards goods, leaving. Nothing speaks to regional trade. Nothing speaks to moving things within countries. And this is why, policies such as the African Continental Free Trade Agreement have become so important, and we've seen how it's played itself out in a number of different ways. One of the projects that came about and was completed, I think 2 years ago, was Kasumbalesa border post, a border post between DRC and Namibia that basically opens up to the Eastern Bloc, also opens up to other countries, whether you're going to Angola, also opens up to Zambia, and these are the trading platforms, trading routes that we need. It is unconscionable for me how we find ourselves in 2022 and there's only one border post between South Africa and Zimbabwe, which is Beitbridge. Not only do we have the most human traffic moving there, but you've got goods traffic also. Why is there no rail? Why do we not have, why are we thinking small on such important topics? If you're looking at the South African power pool, for instance, they've got the day-ahead market that allows trading between Southern African countries. You can trade electricity with Namibia, with Botswana, Angola, Mozambique, no, sorry, not Angola, Mozambique, and slowly but surely we're opening up interconnectors in other regions where we'll be able to trade even there as well. Currently, there is a line that is being built between Malawi, Mozambique, which will allow trade from that part of the country to move into Malawi as well. You've got projects called the Angola-Namibia Interconnector. This will connect Angola to the Southern African power pool. You've got the Botswana-South Africa line. You've got various other lines. And these are the things that matter for African countries. And so, the reason why I've brought this integration up is simply because if we are going to be interconnected and we're going to transmit electricity between countries, surely we need to be focusing on generation. What does this generation mix look like if we are going to be looking at integration? What does the generation mix look like if we're going to be transmitting all the way up to the DRC, all the way up to Angola? What do they need? Oh, and remember that the African continent is sort of like the southern part is sort of shaped like this, right? So we're privileged enough that even though we've got the same time zone, but you've got maybe early rising here and late sun setting there. So you could easily have solar that is in Angola, but is able to supply, let's say, Mozambique when their sun begins to set, because it hasn't set in Angola yet. And these are some of the things that, just thinking big, like in terms of regional trade, regional power trade as well. Now, for me, one of the things that stuck out for me was around industrialization and trade. This is a very big thing for Africa, given that a lot of resources come from Africa, whether you are looking for raw materials, whether you're mining, whether it's agricultural products, a number of things come from the African continent. But if you look at our contribution to manufacturing output globally, we don't even feature. Looking at that entire list, Africa does not, and I'm not even talking about a single country, right? I'm just talking as a continent, not a single country features on that list. And that for me is one of the most painful realizations, that we are thinking far too small and we're letting other issues misdirect us or inconvenience us or take us to places where we shouldn't even be focusing. As Africa, we should be on that list. I mean, you've got Italy, which is featured there, Indonesia, for crying out loud, but not a single African country contributes anything meaningful to global manufacturing output. And one of the key reasons why, as I mentioned earlier, around beneficiation is simply that we do not have the electricity as well to support those factories, to support that manufacturing. As it is, we can barely support the smelters that we have in this country. We can barely support a lot of the industries that we have as well. Therefore, how are we going to compete globally when we don't even have basic electricity to support a school or a household, let alone an entire factory? Now, I want us to go to what happened during COP26, because I don't think I've ever seen such a policy mess globally. We had governments that were saying one thing, you had NGOs saying another thing, you had other countries acting individually, such as South Africa, and you had other countries calling them out on it and basically saying that, how dare you do this when we're trying to negotiate as a collective? Now, I'm going to take quotes from 4 world leaders, and this was on the signing of the partnership, the International Just Energy Transition Partnership between France, Germany, UK, US, and the EU, as well as South Africa. So Boris Johnson, UK Prime Minister, says, moving away from coal is essential if we are to meet our target of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. He says President Ramaphosa has shown real leadership on this issue, and the UK is committed to working with South Africa. Right. The US, this is Joe Biden, says that the new partnership with South Africa will help to transform South Africa's economy to a clean energy economy more quickly. Right now, South Africa is the largest emitter in Africa, due in large part to the heavy reliance on coal. Okay. Emmanuel Macron of France says it will benefit the long-standing cooperation between France and South Africa through the work of the Agence Française de Développement. This is the French Development Bank, which does give Africa and South Africa funding. So Macron is basically looking at it from a financial partnership that it will benefit. Okay. And then Angela Merkel then says that Germany is committed to supporting both the decarbonization of South Africa's electricity production and development of new economic opportunities for affected communities. Now, why did I highlight affected communities? Because in all of these speeches, everything was about money, was about technology, was about climate, was about transitioning to renewable energy, but nobody except Angela Merkel spoke about that there are going to be communities that are affected. Subsequent to this was in November last year, and subsequently the UK, Germany, and the US have since reactivated their coal plants due to gas shortages. The shortages came as a result of there was winter, a very rough winter, and then of course there was the Russia-Ukraine issue now, where, as I explained earlier on, that even Germany, Hungary are saying that they're not going to place sanctions on Russian gas because they need it. But somehow Africa, and South Africa in particular, must accelerate towards this transition. Now, these same countries that are telling Africa to transition, or South Africa, or Zambia or Mauritius to transition, what are they looking like? So they've got a fair mix, and I'll be honest here, they do have a fair mix of renewable energy and of gas, as well as nuclear, but they also do have coal. Looking at Poland, looking at Germany as well. Spain also has hydro, as well as France. And I think for me, looking at this, I look at it and I'm like, yes, I am more pleased looking at numbers like this. They are more in line with what South Africa and with what, okay, I don't want to talk about Africa as a whole here, but rather South Africa, because this is what they're trying to achieve through the integrated resource plan, through a number of different programs and interventions that they have in place. The reason why I'm excluding Africa as a whole is simply because if you look at individual countries, especially in the SADC region, most of them are running hydro, like I said earlier on, at about 80%. Those are not countries that are hard and fast and are stuck on transitioning, because for the most part, their transition is basically sorted. They are now trying to diversify their energy mix so that they are not affected by climate change impacts on the hydro as what they've seen over the last 10 years. So yes, they will be moving towards coal. They will be moving towards renewable energy such as solar and wind. And if in the likes of Mozambique, they've moved towards gas as well to supplement that hydro also. So I look at graphs like this and I am generally happy that we're moving towards the right direction. What I'm not happy with, however, is the push and the accelerated move. If you look at Poland, Germany, France, Spain, and I've just chosen these countries randomly, they don't worry about unemployment. They don't worry about economic transformation. They don't worry about regional trade. France has predominantly nuclear. Germany and Poland have got coal. If Germany has an issue, and they have had issues in the past with their renewable energy, they were able to call on Poland with their coal. They were able to call on France with their nuclear, and they were able to balance their grid doing exactly that. If something happens to South Africa's grid, and as we saw this past weekend with the coal, what happens? Who do we have to call on as South Africa? And this is why regional trading, regional integration, and regional blocks become important. When we speak about reducing emissions, and I showed you number earlier on where I said the EU, their emissions are sitting at 13% of global emissions, because they don't think of themselves as individual countries. They look at themselves as a bloc, and they say, as the EU bloc, we only contribute 13%. But if you were to break them up into individual countries, you'd start seeing that the numbers are a bit scary in certain parts of this bloc. If you were to look at South Africa's emissions in part to Southern Africa's or SADC emissions, South Africa alone, if you look at what they contribute to Africa, I think it's about 43% of greenhouse gas emissions to Africa as a whole. But once we start looking at Africa as a continent as a whole, they only we as a continent only contribute 3.8%. And this is how the likes of the EU have been masking a lot of these numbers also by being part of blocks. And this is why I was very deliberate even when bringing up the greenhouse gas emissions numbers to show Africa as a bloc also, that we are doing something, even though it might seem like it's a fragmented approach, but in our individual countries, when we look at Africa as a whole, we are looking at reducing emissions. And what happens in Mozambique affects South Africa. When South Africa reduces her emissions, she also positively impacts what happens in Namibia or in Angola, for instance. Now, what happened at COP26 that rather scared me, and this was on the back of the slide that we've just been through, but there was a paper, or rather a position statement, to phase out coal. And Australia was one of the first countries to refuse to join 40 other nations who are phasing out coal. And at the time, the Australian Prime Minister of Energy said, "We won't wipe out industries." Flat, plain, simple. That's what he said. We won't wipe out industries. That statement to phase out coal was not signed by Australia, China, Japan, as well as India. If we look at the United States, Canada, and the UK, they pledged to stop overseas investment in coal. Nothing about their own countries. And as I've said, that the US and the UK in particular have reactivated or returned to service their old coal-fired plants because of the gas issues that they're experiencing. And this is why I said it's such a schizophrenic approach to how we approach COP26, well, not even COP26, but just the just energy transition as a whole. We're not singing, like, forget the same hymn book. We're not even singing in the same language. We're not singing the same tune. We're not even singing, I think some are rapping and others are singing gospel is what's happening. You had $8.5 billion US, which was promised to South Africa to transition faster. Now, it's important to note that no other country in the world got this sort of funding. And this was highlighted by the Prime Minister of Barbados, and I've quoted her because if you've listened to her speaking, she's absolutely mesmerizing, she's accurate, she's forceful, and she's direct. I've even included like a link when they share the presentation later. And Mia Motley said, "Commitments based on technologies yet to be developed are at best reckless and are at worst dangerous." She went on further to say, "Do some leaders believe they can survive and thrive on their own? Can there be peace and prosperity in 1/3 of the world if 2/3 are under siege and facing calamitous threats to their well-being? At some point, Mia directly spoke to South Africa's 8.5 billion, it's not a loan yet, it has not become a loan yet, but the pledge that they gave. And she said, all other countries have asked for money to transition, to adapt for their requirements, but somehow this was only given to one country. Why that one country when we're all affected? And she went there representing what we call small island development states, which are extremely affected by climate change impacts. That area of Barbados, of Cuba, Jamaica, I forget all the islands, but that whole space there. Now, how do we transition? Now, there are numerous tools that can be used globally, and they are used globally to transition. The very first lever that many countries pull is obviously the energy supply. So they'll say, we're going to cut down on coal, we're going to increase nuclear like what France has done, we're going to increase our renewable energy like the rest of the world has done, we're going to maybe cut down like on oil, etc. These are all measures that are available, right? And South Africa has exercised this through their integrated resource plan. And like I said, you've got other countries such as Zambia who said, well, we've got a lot of hydro and we would like to supplement this with coal because we've got a diversity issue or a diversification issue, and it's affecting us when there is no hydro. And so this is why they then built Mamba a couple of years ago, Mamba coal. You've got Angola, which said, we've got chronic power shortages and we need something. And so they went and they invested very heavily in Lauca Hydro. You've got Mozambique, that also said, no, we've got lots of hydro, but we need to diversify and we're going to get in gas as well. So this is what the region has been busy with. And South Africa has been busy with a lot of renewable energy since 2011. Then we've also got carbon tax as a measure. And the carbon tax forms part of Eskom's tariff. You've got an environmental levy of 4 cents, and then you've got your carbon tax of 1.5 cents. Now, I'm not entirely a fan of carbon taxes, and I'll tell you why. Simply because when they're implemented broad-based. They don't consider that a Sandton resident pays R1.46 per kilowatt hour, and a Soweto resident also pays R1.46 per kilowatt hour. So you're basically taxing these two people the same 1.5 cents. Now, 1.5 cents, yes, as I'm talking now, it means nothing, right? But if now you are looking at 300, 400 kilowatts that you're buying on a monthly basis, and you compound that over a 12-month period, yes, the money starts adding up. And you're basically saying that the person in Sandton is equally responsible for emissions as the person in Alexandra. Tell me how. And these are some of the issues that I personally grapple with when we speak of carbon taxing and punishing people broadly. Then you've got other countries which say, we're not going to impose taxes. Instead, we are going to have subsidies. China, for I think for 5 years, up until last year, they had a subsidy for electric vehicles, and there was a massive uptake on electric vehicles. This is also true for some European countries, and they went full scale. Last year, as soon as China said the subsidy is finished, all of a sudden there was a gradual shift towards back to using internal combustion engine cars. And it's that shift that you're trying to say, what's the exact balance between a subsidy and people buying, versus having taxing people to a point where they cannot tax, they cannot tax themselves out of that situation also. And and this is why subsidies and carbon taxes go hand in hand, because China is saying, here is a $10,000 or a $5,000 dollar subsidy on this car, whereas South Africa is saying, I'm going to penalize you for using coal, as if Eskom coal calls me every morning and says, hi, Ms. Mashele, would you like to use coal or would you like to use solar like this morning? Then, of course, you've got energy efficiency, electrification, and these are various measures that can be done, whether you're looking at transport, you're looking at buildings, also looking at growth. This one in particular, I do not subscribe to, especially the population one, because it basically says that if you reduce your population, then you won't need more energy or you won't need more things. I don't subscribe to that at all. If you look at population density in Africa versus in other parts of the world, Africa is the least populated continent. Then, of course, you've got economic growth, and some countries say we're willing to sacrifice our economic growth so that we can transition. And so we're willing to kill certain industries so that and more industrialized or more industrial places and convert more to a more service economy. Now, South Africa, that is sitting at, in fact, I should have checked our GDP growth, but it's usually like 1-2%. I don't think we have that lever. I really, really don't. I am subject to all kinds of correction, but I don't think we can lose any other percent. Then, of course, you've got your carbon removal and looking at industry emissions. And there are people that are saying, but you can look at afforestation, which is to basically plant trees. And I know this actually came out this week with the floods that were in KZN, where there are groups that are saying we need to go back to planting trees and to making sure that soil is covered to prevent further issues, of this nature. Then, of course, looking at technology and looking, of course, at carbon capture, storage, and looking at innovative ways to capture this, carbon and in helping us to transition. Then, of course, looking at deforestation and saying we are going to stop cutting down trees. In fact, we're going to grow more trees. I think one of the more, I'm not sure if it's funny or if it's just interesting, but one of the more strange things that I saw in the last 2 years was the methane around the cow farts. Yes, because apparently that is a huge thing in certain parts of the world. And so they had to capture these cow farts because they contributed to greenhouse gas emissions. I'm not entirely sure what the percentage is, but they found that if you gave cows a certain diet and you removed certain things, that it reduced the methane in their diet. And that's how far we've gone into transitioning, looking at what cows are eating, in essence. Now, finally, looking at what will result in a successful transition. Currently, what is driving transition globally and in Africa in particular is public pressure, which is never a good thing. Because like I said, with COP26, people ebb and flow and they move as and when, and you'll follow people down this path and 2 weeks later, they'll be like, no, but we've changed our minds. You've also got falling renewable energy costs, which are driving this change. And of course, improving technology all the time. So we've got our hydrogen now, we've got renewable energy, we've got storage, we've got a number of different things. But actually, what should be driving this transition, this energy transition, if it's going to be successful? And first and foremost, it's people. We cannot neglect the people that are in these communities, and not just the people working at coal-fired plants or in coal mines. We need to remember that there's coal truckers. Just yesterday, I learned that there are 400 trucks that go to Lungile on a daily basis. So I'm assuming each truck maybe does like 2 trips. So that's probably 200 drivers that will be out of work. Okay, that is, if you're looking at the multiplier effect, that's possibly about 1,000 people that will be affected by those 200 drivers being out of work, their families. not being able to put kids through school? What happens to the catering companies that have formed in these communities, mining communities, whether it's catering at these mines, whether it's catering at the power plants, laundry services, the accommodation in that area, taxis in that area, the malls, the various industries that have spun out of, you know, those entities? What happens there? Have we had that conversation? Also, we need to support these countries, African countries and communities, through social protection and new skills. Let's not forget what I said earlier, that if you're looking at skills, Africa has the youngest population in the world. We can't seriously be talking about reskilling a 56-year-old coal plant technician when there is a 21-year-old who is unemployed. What happens? Are we going to forgo the elderly, let them go into early retirement, give them packages, let government give them support packages and support the youth? And then what about those invaluable skills that they have that they will never be able to pass on? So what happens then? You're going to need financial resources. And this is what the world, especially southern countries, have been crying about, just to say, the North, you have contributed to emissions. Yet when it comes to giving us money, you're not willing to give us a cent. You're just saying, oh, we've got loans, we've got concessional funding, we've got this, that, and the other, but we still need to pay. Even the $8.5 billion that was offered to South Africa is a loan and has loan terms and loan conditions. Are we considering resilience? Are we considering climate change when we're talking about transition? It's not good enough just to say, no, we're going to do renewables only and we're going to forget about coal, or we're going to do this. This past weekend showed us how our energy system is not resilient. We had wet weather. We had overcast weather. There was barely any solar. This was last week, Thursday. Last week, Friday, barely any solar, barely any wind. Then it started raining. And you know what then happened is that because of those floods and those very serious rains, they started affecting our coal. So our coal-fired plants suffered. So that's 3 technologies out because of the weather. We're not resilient. Is our transition considering this? Or are we just saying, we're just going to swap out solar for coal? And, you know, and that's that. Are we considering our natural resources and our existing industries? You cannot compare South Africa to Angola, to Mozambique, to Norway, and to the US. Each country must transition according to their resources, according to their skills, but most importantly, according to their people and what their people aspire to do as well. Are we considering immigration and or urbanization, that we're going to get more people moving into city centers? Are our loads sufficient for those people? Are they going to be able to cater for those people? Or are we simply going to build microgrids and say, this community, you must stay where you are and you can never move because we're going to build a microgrid there and you must continue paying for that microgrid into perpetuity because we do not want to connect you to the national grid as well? And finally, if we are going to drive a successful energy transition, especially in Africa, there needs to be a clear path to economic growth, employment, as well as development. Technology swap-outs are not going to transition Africa into any sort of prosperity. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for an insightful presentation, quite thought-provoking. If I could do a round of applause alone, I'd do it. But thank you so much for the presentation. So what I'll do now, I'll allow 1 or 2 rounds of questions. All right. So for each round, I'll allow 3 hands. Okay, I'm sure there's comments and there's questions from the floor. So if you've got questions and you've got any comments, okay, regarding the presentation, this is your time. I see Nkosi Mfundo, and then Nkosi Mfundo. Okay, that's the only hand that I see right now. So Nkosi Mfundo, over to you.
Good afternoon, colleagues. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Yes, thanks. Thank you so much for this thought-provoking session that we have. I have maybe some few questions on whether maybe when this was looked at, there are certain elements maybe I'm thinking that might restrict us into what has been found there. The last point was there needs to be a clear path for energy transition. Now the question is, who creates this path and how this path can be ensured that it provides us with the energy transition that we need in South Africa and in Africa. And while maybe asking that, the other question is that as academics and researchers, do we have the power to influence a successful energy transition without begging for permission from politicians who don't have the ideas that we have? If yes, we have the power, what kind of power do we have in South Africa and Africa? And how have we proved that we have that power? Or perhaps we are powerless as the ordinary person who ends up resorting to anger and put the point across because of the hostile political climate. Because I believe that there should be political willingness and a conducive political climate for us to transition in energy. Maybe if looking into that, maybe trying to look into that, maybe we looked into also the kind of the leadership these other countries provided to achieve better or to be better than us.
Thank you so much. Over to you, Lungile.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mfundo, for those questions. And, you know, I'm going to start with the leadership one first. You will look at the likes of Angela Merkel, for instance. She came in with a green mandate. And she basically said, we're going to phase out nuclear. This is what we're going to do. And I think one of the things that I've seen, especially in the German example, it's long tenure helps in a leader. Secondly, speaking with one voice within the party itself. I think one of the things that I found very strange within the ruling party is how the president and his ministers seem to be speaking from different angles, like on most topics. And of course, looking at, and we cannot neglect this, when you have money, you can make decisions and you can say, this is what I would like to do as a country. And I think this is one of the issues that most African countries battle with, that even though we might have leadership, but our leadership cannot withstand pressure that comes from $8.5 billion facilities. And of course, they will come with their conditions, and they'll come and they'll say, we're going to do 1, 2, 3. And there's not much you can say, because how else are you going to grow your economy? Because you have no money, you have no plan. You're basically a cap in hand president at this point. If you look, and then to your second question around the role of academia, I cannot overemphasize that enough. And some of my thoughts, my ideas, even when I share them with my colleagues like at work, are drawn from the academic spaces. There is definitely need for greater collaboration, especially on this topic. I remember on numerous conversations I've had with Eskom around the just energy transition and them expanding the base of people that they consult. And I know that they have, and they've brought in consultants that will allow them to actually do so, speaking to local communities, speaking to academia, speaking to people that will be directly and indirectly affected by the just energy transition. And people have come out voicing very strong strong opinions of whether they feel yes or no. But I think one of the things that we've neglected is business forums. We've also neglected the likes of trade unions as well. And not that I understand why, but they've sort of relegated them to the end, and they've said once we're done with consulting people, we'll get to those ones because they're a bit tricky. But unfortunately, if you do not deal with the elephant first, the other smaller things are not really going to matter in the end, because that is where your just energy transition is going to get killed. If your unions don't believe that you're acting on behalf of people and that you're trying to speak to people behind their backs, and this is a lot of what we've been seeing as well. You asked about who creates the path, and we all do. It's government, it's academia, it's the ordinary person on the street, it's affected communities, it's mining industries, it's coal industries, lobby groups, NGOs. Everybody needs to stand up and say, this is how it will impact me. Are you transitioning for me, or are you transitioning for your own technology reasons? I hope I've answered you.
Thank you so much, Lungile, and thank you so much, Mfundo, for the question and the comments that you've made. I noted a hand by Rena Stoltz. Pardon me if I'm pronouncing the name wrong. Rena Stoltz.
Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. I just my question is more about human behavior. Basically, transformation meaning change, and changing humans and their behavior. That's a big thing. Yes, you can probably do it from leadership and everything, but how do you propose using human behavior, psychology, and economic behavior to assist in this transition and basically the change management of the whole thing? How do you approach that? And then do you think immediately a big change, or rather small steps building Rome? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rena. Lugi.
Yes, thank you, Rainier. You raise a very important point, and I've been quoted a number of times saying if we do not handle this just energy transition correctly in South Africa, we could find ourselves in the middle of a civil war. If you look at what has happened over the last, let me say, 2 years with COVID and certain industries shutting down and certain companies, and then you enter into last year as well with the riots that we had in July, and then you factor into account the impact that these floods will have on employment as well. And we basically have the perfect recipe for a civil war, ultimately. And all you need is just one violent spark, and it seems to be growing very slowly, but very surely, especially in the electricity space in Soweto. And that might just be the spark that will lead us to where we do not want to be. And the ultimate thing, what you're raising, is that there are multiple facets that need to be considered. We can all sit in the fanciest rooms and discuss how we're going to transition, but if you haven't told people, and this is what's lacking, how is this going to affect them? Have we sat down with people in Mpumalanga and said, we need to shut down coal-fired plants and the resulting coal mines for reason 1, 2, 3, for your health, for our economy and our transition? Have you explained what the economic impact is going to be? Have you explained what the social impact is going to be, that your child will not be able to go to that school anymore because you will no longer be able to work in this province unless we come up with another plan to reskill you or redeploy you? And we know that unemployment is sitting high. So if you're saying to a coal miner's child that, or a coal miner, that you will have to move to Northern Cape, for instance, because you know how to mine, and in the Northern Cape we're now going to be mining or we're going to be working like on hydrogen, so we're going to move you there. What happens to his child or his children? What happens to wives? What happens to families? Are we not doing another apartheid issue where you're sending people to live like in hostels all over again. And you're absolutely right that there needs to be a conjecture between the psychology bit, the economic bit, as well as the social bit. And I think that is exactly what is missing. I do not have an answer of how it can be done. I've tried looking at how other countries try and transition. We all saw the yellow jackets in France. We've all seen the protests all over the world when first world countries tried to transition too quickly. We saw the protests in the US, and immediately when governments come and they change, they revert back to the old and they say, no, we're going to go back to coal. Because unfortunately, you're voted in by the population. And if we handle this incorrectly as a country, we will end up in flames. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lungile, and thank you so much to Renier for the question. I'll take one more hand because of time. Olatunji Obafemi, over to you.
Hi, thank you so much, the presenter. Good afternoon, everyone. I listened to the presentation and I must say it is thought-provoking. Moreover, as it has to do with our own continent, Africa here. Yeah, the presenter, you have raised a lot of questions that is still beckoning for answer. I mean, we can talk over and over again about some of the concerns that have been raised. And, you know, for me, when you began to roll out the statistics as it regard the current state of coal in some of these developed countries and us, one of the things that I actually was asking, and then you began to ask about the issue of industrialization in Africa. Why do we have so much resources, and why are we not even having anything to show in terms of manufacturing among the big manufacturing countries or continents in the world, right? One thing I concluded there is that as Africa, we have been subservient for so long, right? You discover that we're just like a playing ground where the developing country, they come and harness the resources. They take the resources to the other side. They produce the product, and then we become the selling ground. Instead of it to be the other way around, whereby we're the one selling to them in terms of technology. So there's no way you want to talk about that without actually talking about the leadership willpower, right? We've got to a point whereby most of the leaders in Africa, we depend so much to the extent that even to dictate how we run our economy is at the mercy of the big players. So one thing that must happen, if you would ask me my opinion, there is that, see, taking advantage of development zone that we've got in Africa, we need to begin to look at how we can begin to indigenize this technology. Now, there is nothing bad in us producing some of this technology. There is nothing in us insisting that, no, if you are coming to sell this product here, we want certain percentage of the production plant to be here on the continent under certain conditions for us to be able to at least maximize the process. I guess that was how China started. From what I have learned, China started reversing the engineering. They started reversing the technologies in order to be able to produce something they can actually indigenize. And you see where China is now. Most of the country, they run to China to produce their products. So what about if we actually begin to take a learning from that too, and we begin to look at how we can become self-sustained in terms of manufacturing? See, as long as we are not able to do some of these things ourselves, we may not be able to attain a just society in general. And in fact, the issue of just energy transition may even elude us, because we will have to depend on the dictates of the developed country for us to be able to know how we run our continent. So I want to submit on that note. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Obafemi. Lungile, I don't know whether you want to comment on that.
Actually, I do not directly like on that, but what an excellent point, right? And I think I'm inspired by seeing what has been happening in Nigeria over the last couple of years. Nigeria last year but they built their refinery owned by Dangote. So a single man came and said, listen, we can no longer continue like this. Nigeria is Africa's largest oil producer. The oil was going to Rotterdam in Europe to be refined there and being brought back, and Nigerians were buying it in US dollars. And then it was being sold to South Africa. Why has South Africa not said, we will refine? We will increase refining capacity. Nigeria, bring all your oil to us and we can then send it to Angola if you have to. Why have, and Nigerian oil, I also know, goes to SAR in Senegal as well. Why did it take one single man to say, enough is enough? We're no longer sending our oil all over the world. Nigeria will refine its own oil and will sell at US dollars to the rest of the world. When we look at where Nigeria has climbed up in terms of their GDP growth, and they're going to continue climbing. And they're only battling really with Egypt, at this point, and competing for the top spot. But ultimately, that's how it starts. It starts with people who will say, I'm willing to turn and change the tide of where my country is going, and this is what I would like to do. And it speaks to everything that you mentioned in your comment, that you need leadership. You need people who are strong, who are visionary, and who know what they would like to achieve ultimately.
Thank you so much, Lungile, and thank you for the question, Obafemi. Colleagues, because of time, we have to end our insightful session. Okay, and Lungile, on behalf of the University of Johannesburg, on behalf of the Department of Geography and the Center for Cyber, Physical, Food, Energy and Water Center, we wish to say thank you for making time and sharing your thoughts on the just energy transition, particularly in Africa. The one buzzword that I kept on hearing was contextualized development, localized development. So thank you so much, Lungile, and thank you so much to all the attendees. Thank you for making the time to come through and the questions that we received. Thank you so much. The center will, throughout the year, I believe, will be having more of these sessions where we share and discuss some of these topics that are of importance when it comes to development, particularly in Africa. Right? Thank you so much, everyone. And on that note, I wish to dismiss us all. Have a great weekend.